Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Miles Arnone, the CEO of Rebuild Manufacturing, all about what went wrong with the U.S. industrial base and how it can be fixed. And then we break down the latest on the U.S. Iran war and the Pentagon's controversial direct financial stakes in defense and critical minerals companies. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and it's great to have Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times, back on the show this week. A big thanks to our colleague Vaughn Cockayne for helping hold down the fort for the past couple of weeks. Coming up in a bit, we have what I think is one of the best interviews of the year so far with Miles Arnone of Rebuild Manufacturing. If you want a clear, concise explanation of what's going wrong with the U.S. defense industrial base over the past 2-3 decades and how it can be fixed, stay tuned because Miles is at the forefront of that effort and he explains very clearly how we got here and how he thinks the U.S. can once again lead the world in manufacturing, including of the key materials and minerals crucial for the advanced tech weapons boom that we're all in today. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be back with you after a couple weeks away. Off the top, we're obviously continuing to track the fast evolving meltdown of the U.S. Iran ceasefire and memorandum of understanding deal, with U.S. military forces having carried out airstrikes on Iranian targets for several consecutive days, and Iran retaliating with drone and missile attacks on U.S.-aligned Arab nations like Bahrain and Jordan. The ceasefire is unquestionably dead, and we're now at the precipice of a new all-out war scenario, potentially. There's real risk of, I think, media exhaustion to all of this, or a sense that this is the new normal, a kind of tit-for-tat permanent stalemate after what the Trump administration had repeatedly claimed would be a swift end with Iran's theocratic regime capitulating and giving up its nuclear weapons program. That seems like a confusing, far-off goal at this point on July 16 as we tape this. Ben, I don't mean to be political or hyper-skeptical here. I'm just telling you like it is. In the administration, President Trump particularly has spent the past couple of days threatening a kind of game-changing escalation of increased and more powerful waves of U.S. airstrikes, while Iranian leaders on July 16 threatened anew to, quote, reduce buildings around the Persian Gulf to rubble if the U.S. tries to bomb critical infrastructure inside Iran. I know that there's planning in place for such kinds of bombing waves, but I don't have any indication that the administration is going to pull the trigger on that, although we'll be watching and tracking it very closely in the daily Threat Status newsletter over the coming week, Ben. All of this happens as the threat of renewed price increases in global oil supplies continues. It's not a good situation. And I think the really big question is, how does the Trump administration make a move of some kind here that could avoid an endless war type situation that the president campaigned against, that his base doesn't want, and so on. You know, could it be something that more robustly involves Saudi Arabia, perhaps the government of Iraq, right, which has this long border and history with Iran? It's notable that Iraqi Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi visited with President Trump at the White House on July 14. One of the big questions there was this extent to which the Iraqi government is capable of disarming Iran-backed militias that operate inside Iraq. Again, we're tracking that in the Daily Threat Status newsletter. Ben, before I hand this back to you, though, there's another item that I want to highlight on my radar. that didn't get so much attention in the U.S. media, but it was this joint international news scoop by the German publication Der Spiegel, France's Le Monde newspaper, and the Latvia-based Russian dissident publication, The Insider, which claimed to uncover classified documents about a secret China Russia military meeting back in 2023, in which plans were discussed by those two U.S. adversaries to carry out some kind of attack campaign to neutralize the space-based satellite communications network Starlink. That's, of course, the network of Elon Musk's SpaceX, which, as we've discussed many times on this podcast, has been a crucial communications tool relied upon by the Ukrainian military in their war against Russian invaders. I digress on this for now. Ben, our colleague Bill Gertz did a deep dive on this China-Russia collaboration. I hope listeners will check it out. The headline on the Threat Status web pages is "Classified Documents Reveal Chinese Plan to Destroy Starlink Satellites."
Yeah, it's a great story. You mentioned the Iranian threats toward its neighbors in the region. That puts a really big spotlight back on Patriot missile batteries, which a lot of those Gulf Arab nations, allies of the U.S., have relied on to protect itself from Iranian onslaughts, as have our troops. And as has Ukraine, particularly from recent Russian ballistic missile attacks against Kyiv. They've said they don't have enough of them. But remember, last week on this show, we talked about how the U.S. apparently can't make enough Patriot missile batteries here domestically. So we need to license them to Ukraine to build them themselves, even though President Trump admitted that the two prime contractors for Patriots, RTX and Lockheed Martin, didn't know about this plan. And it's not exactly clear how it's going to work. But you take that and then you add to it something I wrote about this week in the Washington Times, and that's that the U.S. also can't seem to make enough 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. The goal laid out in the Pentagon's National Defense Industrial Strategy Implementation Plan calls for monthly production of 100,000 rounds by last October. As of March of this year, the Army had increased its monthly production to just 36,000 rounds. Now, the Pentagon Inspector General's report that I wrote about does say that production is set to increase dramatically and could reach as much as 71,000 rounds soon, but that's still far short of the goal. And even though some Army facilities are ramping up their production of those artillery shells at a high level, the problem seems to lie, according to the Pentagon Inspector General, with a facility in Mesquite, Texas, that makes the projectile metal parts for 155 millimeter rounds. That plant is operated by General Dynamics Ordnance and Tactical Systems and was expected to produce 30,000 rounds of ammunition every month, but it's not. Now, the company told Breaking Defense in a statement it's planning to invest more money in that facility. It has already, and it wants to ramp up production. So we'll see if that happens. But, Guy, we can't make enough missiles and we can't make enough artillery ammunition. That's a big problem. And it's why the Pentagon, I think, is moving to take direct financial stakes in a growing number of companies in and around the defense sector to speed up production of things like this and things like solid rocket motors or the processing of rare earth elements, which it needs for cell phones and fighter jets and just about everything else the 21st century U.S. military uses. So I did a deep dive this week on how the Defense Department has taken those direct equity stakes, meaning they have partial ownership in a company in at least 4 different firms. And I'd encourage you to go read that to get some more details on who they are, how much money's involved, and how the strategy is dividing Republicans on Capitol Hill. But, it's one of those interesting things in journalism, Guy, that as I'm writing the story, the news kind of changes before my eyes, because just this week, the Pentagon's Office of Strategic Capital, which we need to do a deep dive on sometime soon because it's becoming a huge power center inside the Pentagon in terms of delivering loans and other financial backing to companies deemed important to the defense industrial base. But that office announced a new program just this week called the National Security Fund Finance Program, which will, quote, provide loans to qualified investment fund managers who will combine OSC, Office of Strategic Capital, loans with private capital to invest in portfolio companies focused on addressing U.S. national security shortages related to critical minerals and materials, unquote. So in other words, I need to do some more reporting on this, but it sure sounds to me from that definition like the plan is to loan government money, taxpayer money, through the Office of Strategic Capital to investment funds that will then in turn invest money into companies processing rare earth elements or operating a copper mine or something like that. The thinking, I guess, being this provides something of a buffer or a middleman to the taxpayer, that if you have this investment fund that's putting the money in, if the company goes belly up, then the investment fund will be responsible for repaying the United States Treasury or the Pentagon in this case. I just wonder, it just seems like there's a minefield here of potential corruption. Is it legal? I have a lot of questions about it, Guy.
Well, it used to be, if we roll back just the last 20 years, from where we sit on this side of the mirror in the news industry as journalists, that there would be an announcement of a contract with a private defense firm. Now, increasingly, particularly since the Trump administration came back into office, you see the Pentagon issue press releases announcing an investment in a private company. So there are tons of implications here. There are hawkish peace through strength analysts across the U.S. national security community. Most of them Republican, some of them Democrat, who are actually privately cheering this on, saying it's very much needed to change the way that the Pentagon does business and partners with the defense industrial landscape to compete in the great power realm, specifically with China, which has an all of government approach to state ownership of defense industrial production. But if you're a cynic, I think you have to be asking about the prospect of really risky investments, number one, like you just brought up. But then also, if you're really a cynic, I think you're looking at the prospect of profiteering by individuals who get in the middle of this process. And some would say, okay, well, that's fine. There's this Trump administration, they trust that things will go fine with them. But what happens when there's a Democratic administration that comes in, or a return of something like Obama or Biden? So the politics surrounding the way this money moves to industry are very sensitive on both sides.
No, absolutely. And I raised the prospect in my piece this week that it actually could raise strategic concerns for the U.S. military over the medium and long terms. And I don't think that's a stretch, because if you end up in a situation where the Pentagon, the military, feels compelled to use a particular capability because we literally have an ownership stake in it, and the U.S. taxpayer could stand to make money if more of those things are produced and that company does well in the stock market, does that make commanders want to use that thing more than something else and actually make strategic and planning decisions about U.S. tactics and strategy in theater based on these business decisions being made in the Office of Strategic Capital, for example? Maybe that's totally off base and I'm going way too far with this line of thinking, but I think it's a question worth asking. And I can tell you, based on my reporting this week, that even Republicans on Capitol Hill are privately asking that question right now. And we are joined now by Miles Arnone, the CEO of Rebuild Manufacturing, a company that aims to revitalize domestic manufacturing with secure supply chains here in America. The company works, of course, in a host of different sectors. We're interested especially in defense and tech here on this show. And I know you're excited to talk about all of that, Miles. So thank you for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So I explained a little bit there of what you all do, but take us a bit deeper, for folks who might not know. What's sort of the elevator pitch, if you will, for Rebuild Manufacturing and what you all are doing over there?
Sure. I think it's best by stating the problem. I think the problem that we're trying to solve or fix is that in the U.S., we have a pretty diminished industrial base based on 40 years of offshoring. And the industrial base we have left is largely built up of small to medium-sized firms in engineering and manufacturing that tend to each do one thing really well. And the problem is that today, the next generation of hard tech products, whether they're in defense or aerospace or energy or automation, are multi-system, multi-domain products. So they involve many different processes, many different engineering domains. And it's really hard to coordinate across all these little firms and create those products. If you think about China with Shenzhen is kind of an organizing methodology, or Japan with Keiretsu, or Korea with Chaebol, they all have built a method of organically organizing a very large surface area, technically and manufacturing wise. And we haven't done that yet. So Rebuild's goal is to ensure that the next generation of really important hard tech products are designed and built here, and that requires a level of integration that doesn't exist currently. So what we've built in the last 5 years now is a business that today is about, let's call it 1,300 people, of which maybe 420 of which are engineers. And we can cover a very broad surface area in terms of the engineering that we do and the manufacturing capabilities that we bring. So we help customers take their idea from the bench or even earlier through low rate production all the way to high rate production. And we want to basically be the next General Electric in terms of an industrial conglomerate pre it being sort of made into a financial institution.
Miles, what are some of the, you kind of just touched on this, but let's dive a little deeper here. What are the actual bottlenecks to manufacturing in the United States right now? Because we keep hearing problems about scaling up to build the things we need, whether it's, chemicals, solid rocket motors, processing of rare earth elements, all these things. And, I know this sounds simple and maybe just a little bit naive, but it seems like everybody wants this to happen. All the stakeholders want this to happen. We've done it before in this country. Where does it break down? Why is it not just as simple as we build the things we need, the facilities we need, hire the people we need, and get it done? Where does that process kind of break down right now in the U.S.?
That's a great question. So before getting to the bottleneck part of that, I just want to comment that I think when you referred to having done it before, you're probably speaking about during World War II when we converted large amounts of the industrial base to produce military gear. And I think that in that era, it was a lot easier, frankly, because the differences between the products that we were making for the commercial market and the military products were not so great. So making a car or a truck in the 40s and a tank looked a lot more alike than making those two classes of products would look today. But in terms of the bottlenecks today, I think the issue is if you think about a product, let's just say a drone, right, for argument's sake, and you look at a Sankey diagram of that product. So on the left, you have the drone. And then as you move from left to right, you keep going down the supply chain into subsystems. So you have the drone, then you have motors, then you have the windings for the motors, and then the wire itself and magnets, and then rare earth. And you keep going all the way to the right where you end up at raw materials, right? What we've done in the US is stripped clean most of the right half of those diagrams. We don't do those things anymore. And so what we've become really good at and what we focused on, and this was largely driven by, again, this offshoring that a lot of Silicon Valley, but other parts of the economy drove to, is we've kept top level design as something we do, and the final assembly of these products, but not all of the subsystems that are needed to source into those things. We've allowed that to go elsewhere. And so as soon as you start getting into the nitty gritty, you realize, okay, I can design this product and I can bolt it together here, but I can't get 80% of the components that are needed for that product domestically. And so we've kind of come at this problem, and I think are still a little bit coming at it in reverse, which is we need to start at the beginning, which is rare earth magnets, wiring, all of the electronics, meaning circuitry, and also chips, et cetera, and then move forward up to the integrated products. And it's mastery of the subsystems that leads to better end product and differentiation on the end product. And as we started in defense, particularly making more and more exquisite product, we sort of confused ourselves into thinking that putting together exquisite products was the same thing as having a well-defined, in control, owned supply chain, and it's not.
You mentioned sort of dual use, in commercial. I want to come back to that in just a minute. But while we're on this subject, I'm curious where you come down on the idea of the government getting more involved financially, whether it be loans or increasingly, equity, direct financial stakes in companies doing some of this work. We saw that L3 Harris solid rocket motor spinoff is just one example. And the NDAA, currently making its way through the Senate, would kind of change and codify in some ways the Pentagon's ability to do that and lay out some more specific parameters of how it can take financial stakes, set limits on how much it can take. Is this a good thing? I mean, do you see this as a positive development, or does this eventually kind of go too far? And I hate to use the phrase un-American, but does it start to not really look like the system we're all used to at a certain point here?
Well, I think we should be honest with ourselves that the government's been intimately involved in American industry forever, frankly. So if you look at anything that's come out of Silicon Valley in the last 25 years, and you go back down its Sankey diagram, you find that the core technology largely came out of some government lab. So we've been investing in US industry in other ways forever. And I think that's quite appropriate, particularly where you have very high risk fundamental research that has to be done before something can move towards a commercialization phase, right? Whether that's in quantum computing or AI, or the internet is famously a government product, right? Effectively, and so on. I think that's different, though, when you start getting to the government. And I also, therefore, support very highly, by the way, government incentives to drive innovation in these companies, right? Whether that's through procurement or competitions like the Drone Dominance Program, all of these methods, and I think many of them are driving a more commercial stance in the Department of War and elsewhere. And I think that's proving to be very effective. Of course, it can be refined and work better in a number of ways, but generally, I think it's quite good. Now, I think when you get to ownership, however, that's a different matter. So I think upside and ownership aren't always the same thing and shouldn't be. So personally, I'm a big fan of the fact that if the government gives a loan to a business for a substantive development like a rare earth magnet mine, a rare earth magnet material mine, they should have upside because it's a very high risk behavior, right? But ownership creates a situation where what happens to the parties that are competing with them that are not owned by the government? Are they disadvantaged? Are there moral hazards there? And I think there very well could be. So I personally am a fan of upside in the form of warrants or other opportunities for the government when they make risky bets through loans or contracts, the like. But I draw the line personally at government ownership. But that's just one man's opinion.
No, that's fair enough. And one man's opinion, but I've heard a similar sentiment from a number of other sources. So I don't think you're alone on that. One more quickly on the dual use and commercial. I'm curious whether this underlying concept is going to eventually run into some problems. I've heard from a number of sources in Silicon Valley in particular lately that it seems like there's an energy moving toward young entrepreneurs and startups saying focus on defense tech because that's where the money is going to be to get these government contracts, get Pentagon contracts. Does commercial first kind of run out of road at a certain point where it's like, well, if all the money, if this is where the money is, that's what the companies are going to want to do, and then it ceases being truly quote unquote commercial first and the first. Do you think that is that a concern, or am I blowing that out of proportion, or is that something eventually that you think we could confront in this system?
I do think it will be problematic if, and I think it's happening, the vast majority of current industrialization activity in the US is defense oriented. Like the amount of money and focus by venture capital, private equity, and therefore the companies they invest in is really slanted towards defense. And the problem with that is a very large number of those companies, and therefore a very large amount of the capital that goes into it, is going to get flushed down the toilet. That's the nature of the system. So, right, in venture, you're looking for 1 in 10 winners. So that implies that 90% of the initial capital that goes into these things is going to be a loss. So I think that is dangerous. The good news, however, though, Ben, and so in some ways I think this may solve itself, is that as we move from a defense establishment that's focused on a small number of exquisite products. So you think about the Navy, what do they have? Sub 300 ships, right, at scale, to a situation where you want mass, meaning huge numbers of attritable or smaller dollar items, but the total mass is going up. The technologies you need to use there look more and more like what you would use for commercial or consumer products than they did in the prior instance of exquisite airplanes, exquisite freighters, exquisite aircraft carriers, et cetera. So there's this convergence where the technology that's going into drones, whether those be land-based, sea-based, air-based, et cetera, for example, and what you would use to make commercial products, they start to converge. And I think that's going to happen increasingly. And you could say the same thing in automation, same thing in energy, right? So if you think about batteries, lithium-based cells are going to be used in defense applications. They're immediately usable in commercial applications. As you make higher energy density batteries for the defense establishment for flying applications, those are going to have knock-on benefits for commercial. So I do think there's a convergence in the technology, but I still think we need to be careful that we don't get so enamored of the defense tech that we, again, make things that don't have the ability to be used more broadly, or we'll be in the same situation that we just were in, which is an ill-defined, ill-developed industrial base that lives or dies on defense spending. That's not really helpful.
I'm curious how hard it is right now, just broadly speaking, to operate in this current economic environment. I mean, we're talking about the reshaping of the defense industrial base and ramping up domestic manufacturing, everything we just talked about. And at the same time, then you've got uncertainty around the Trump administration's tariffs policy, skyrocketing fuel prices and a volatile stock market because of the Iran war. So I mean, how much does that impact what you all are trying to do at Rebuild and other companies kind of across this landscape? Does that volatility make this harder?
The good news for Rebuild is it's not really much of a factor for us at all because we are not PE or venture backed in the conventional sense. We have permanent capital, a very well funded balance sheet. We're building a business that we want to be here 50 years from now. Our Rebuild Way principles are all built on this idea that we're not buying businesses to sell them. We're not looking to flip things. We're building a substantive enterprise. So we have a very long-term view about what we're doing. And many of the things you just named, I think, are short-term, high volatility events. So yes, they're annoying, but they don't affect what we're doing. I think for the market at large, however, they're very problematic because if you run a venture fund or a PE fund and you have a 10-year fund life, you got to buy businesses, get them in shape in 3 years and flip them to generate returns to raise your next fund. And that means this volatility really makes it hard to make good decisions, I think. So it's problematic in that way, I'd say generally. But for us at Rebuild, not so much. We, in terms of the customers we work with, the markets we go after, the work we do, the technology we develop, we take a very long-term view.
There was some news last week, kind of unexpected news for those of us who cover this, that President Trump said that the U.S. is going to license the production of Patriot missiles back to Ukraine so they can build them there. I mean, he even said publicly that the administration had not told the prime contractors on the Patriot system, RTX and Lockheed Martin, about this beforehand, and sources have told me that it could be years before the first Patriots actually get built in Ukraine. But setting that aside, broadly speaking, is this the opposite of what you want to see? We're talking about a cutting-edge American-produced weapons system that now, countries from Europe to the Mideast desperately want to buy, and now we're talking about it actually being physically made in another country. What's your take? Is this just kind of an isolated incident, or did this announcement trouble you because of those reasons?
It troubles me because it's a poster child for the problem that we have from all of this deindustrialization we've allowed to happen. We literally have a product in super high demand that we have unique capability to design and make, and we can't produce it, right? And so we're forced to license it to others to make it so that they can defend themselves. So, I mean, I commend the idea in the sense of the current problem, you have to do something. But what it says more broadly is very troubling, right? Which is we can't even make the things that we've been making for many years at scale and scale up rapidly enough such that licensing is a better, more appealing option than just trying to fix our own manufacturing environment. That's terrible, right? And I think part of this comes down to the fact that so many people, so much money, so many entrepreneurs have flooded the zone here on manufacturing resilience and improving the manufacturing base that now we have like a traffic jam of many cockamamie ideas and half-baked process concepts and so on, competing with more experienced companies, more experienced people, more experienced capital that knows what to do. And it's really kind of making a muck of the thing. So hopefully that overshoot will settle down and the field will clear a little bit, because I think the example you just gave is very troubling in what it says about where we are.
Yeah. Okay. Last thing, Miles, to wrap up here, I want to ask a little more specifically about sort of the worker aspect of this, the human being aspect of this. What's the process as you see it for kind of evaluating where we need to put manufacturing facilities in this country? I mean, I know growing up in a coal mining town in central Pennsylvania, the coal was there, so people came there and did the job. How do we think about that now in 2026 and beyond, what kind of people we're looking for, and therefore what kind of areas we're going to actually do this?
Well, at Rebuild, what we're doing is we go to the places where there's been deindustrialization and there's a deep culture of manufacturing, or the goal or desire by a lot of people to work in that environment, and they understand what it's about and they have the skills. So you mentioned Pennsylvania. We worked with the Allegheny County Commission and so on in New Kensington to take an old Alcoa plant and refurb the whole thing and make it into an industrial hub, because the culture there values that kind of work. There are a lot of people that worked in difficult manufacturing environments and are amenable to that, and so it's easier to sort of jumpstart there. So we want to go to the places that had done this for decades and they understand it. The whole culture is built around that. There's often good supply chain there, even if it's kind of weakened from what it was, and rebuild in those areas. That said, the situation right now is such that, again, every company and their brother is trying to set up a plant. And so there's really a run on the kind of labor that you need for this sort of work. And so it's been challenging. Our answer to that is we built a lot of internal apprentice programs and training programs where we can bring people who would otherwise have gone to work at Chipotle or whatever and bring them into this environment where, frankly, they can earn better wages over a longer period of time. Because, as you know, if you went into Chipotle, probably in 2 or 3 weeks, you could master every job there. And if that's true, then you can't have real wage growth over time. And if you can't have real wage growth, then you can't participate in the U.S. system, right? Which is expensive to participate in. Democracy is expensive. So we're trying to bring these high quality jobs that have long-term prospects for productivity improvement and therefore long-term prospects for wage growth back to the areas that had them for many, many years. Like you said, Pennsylvania is a great example. Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, the whole Midwest, that whole corridor was just America's factory for decades, and we stripped that out. And we need to rebuild it, I think, both for our social political stability and also to support national security.
Miles Arnone from Rebuild Manufacturing. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed that.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week. Guy, what do you have for us as your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week is that international law is not working to resolve potential conflicts around the world, and that the U.S. government needs to be careful about how it approaches the entire issue of international law. There's a lot of nuance here, Ben, but let me point out 2 quick things. The past week saw U.S. military and State Department officials openly complaining that China is violating international law, specifically a 2016 ruling by the Hague-based Permanent Court of Arbitration, by making aggressive military moves and sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. The problem here, and I know some listeners will say I'm mixing apples and oranges, but the problem is that on the same week U.S. officials made this complaint about China violating international law, the State Department put out a press release saying the U.S. is launching a new campaign to dismantle the Hague-based international court's, quote, threat to American sovereignty, end quote. I'm sure there are, again, some listeners who will say the real threat here is the ICC. But my threat of the week is that the U.S. needs to be careful about trying to have it both ways. International law may be wildly debatable, but we can't just point to it and say we like it when we can use it to ping our adversaries, but we don't think it exists if it's pointed at us.
My threat of the week is the potential move by the Trump administration to bring Turkey back into the F-35 fighter jet program. I mentioned this briefly last week, but it deserves a deeper dive. This issue's been near and dear to my heart because I've been writing about the F-35 and all of its cost overruns and delays and general problems with the program since I started covering national security for the Washington Times almost 10 years ago. And this is one aspect that's really important because the F-35 is a key cog in America's relationship with allies. We bring other countries into the program, such as Israel, help train their pilots how to use the F-35 fighter jet and then sell it to their military. Turkey had been one of those countries until they were kicked out of the program in 2019 because the country also bought the Russian S-400 missile system. And security insiders, as we've discussed on this show before, have long warned that if Turkey owns and operates both, the S-400 could essentially be used as a backdoor into the internal workings of the F-35 and theoretically compromise it. So you can't have both, except I guess maybe to some limited degree you can. The Trump administration wants to allow Turkey back into the program. Now, Turkey, of course, says it's trying to solve the problem here and reportedly could get rid of the S-400 system by selling it to another country, likely the United Arab Emirates. And Turkey also says the S-400 was never actually integrated into NATO's air defenses. Turkey, of course, is a NATO member. So there are signs from all parties here that maybe this is no big deal, right? I'm just not sure because we were told that the Qatari Air Force One was also totally secure and everything was fine. And then President Trump had to take the old airplane back from a NATO summit in Turkey, ironically, earlier this month because of apparent security concerns with the new plane. So Just because all the countries involved and all the stakeholders involved say there are no major security concerns on the table anymore doesn't necessarily make it true. Do we find out later that even if the S-400 was sitting in storage, that there was some sophisticated Russian bug planted on the box that allowed it to get intel about the F-35's radar capabilities? I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek here, but just a little bit, because I personally am really skeptical about all of this, and that's why it's my threat of the week. So with that, a big thanks, Guy. It's great to have you back on the show. A huge thanks to Miles Arnone from Rebuild Manufacturing for that deep dive into the U.S. Defense Industrial Base. And most of all, of course, thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all your friends, and we'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.